Got it. Okay. I think I'm going to turn this light on here. Okay. There we go. So firstly, as I mentioned at the beginning, just want to thank everybody for your tefillos for my mother and her surgery this week. Baruch Hashem went well. May she have a refuah shalema. Tonight, Lahadol ben Chaim L'Chaim, we're going to dedicate our Pre-Shabbos Ruach to Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twerski, Rav Avram Yeshua Heschel ben Morenu Harav Yaakov Yisrael Zecher Tzadik Livracha, known in his family as Uncle Shia, as many of those people who we grew up with would refer to him, his nieces and nephews, and the Reb Shia to other members as well. And we'll be talking about him for really the course of this program. What I'd like to do at the beginning is begin with L'Chadodi, as we always do. And at the end of the program, I'm going to close with Rabbi Dr. Twerski's famous Nigun Hoshia Esamecha. L'Chadodi likras kalari rabbi badiri dadai didai p'nei Shabbos nekabela. Didi rabbi bye bye l'chadodi likras kala. Didi rabbi bye p'nei Shabbos nekabela. Aishamar v'zachar b'dibur echad. Ishmiyanu kel hamiyuchad ayay. Didi ram bye bam. Didi bye bam bye bye. Hashem echad u'shemayah echad l'shem. U'l'sif eretz v'lisila. Ay l'chadaydi. L'ikras kahala. P'nei Shabbos nekabela. Didi-didi-dam, bye-bye-bye-da-da-dam. Didi-didi-dam, bye-bye-bye-bam-bam. Didi-dam, bye-bye-bye-bam. Didi-didi-dam, bye-bye. Bye-bye, v'shalom ateres pala. Gamerina u'b'tzala. Didi-dam, bye-bye. Baby, bye bye, Talchemune. I'm Segula, Bawichala, Bawichala, Bawichala. Shabbos Makisa. Lechadaidi. Likaras Kahala. P'nei Shabbos Nekabelam. Didai-dam, bye-bye-bam, bye-di-di-dim. Didi-didi-dam, bye-bye-dam. Dim-bye-bye-bam, bye-bye-bye-bam. Didi-da-da-da-dam, bye-da. Didi-da-ba-bam-bam, bye-da-da-da-dam, bye-bye-bye-bye-bye-bye-bye-bye. Didi-da-da-da-dam, bye-bam. Didi-didi-dam, bye-bye. Didi-di-dam, bam, bye-bye-bye-bam-bam. Didi-da-da-da-da-da-dam, bye-bye-bye. Didi-dam, bye-bam. Didi-da-da-bam, bam, bye-bye-bye-bye-bye. Didi-didi-dam, bye-bye-bye-bam, bye-bye-bam-bye-didi-dam. Didi-da-bye-bye-dam, bam-bam. Didi-da-dam, bye-bye-bam, bye-didi-dam. Didi-didi-dam, bye-bye-dam. Din-da-da-dam, bye-bye-bye-bam. Didi-da-da-da-da-da-dam. Nice to see everybody singing along out there in your wonderful homes. Let me begin in talking about Rabbi Dr. Twerski. When I first met him, along with the Rebbitzin, we have to have a little bit of historical background. There was a great Rebbe and a great Rebbitzin in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee Rebbe was Rabbi Yaakov Yisroel Twerski. He and his Rebbitzin came to America from Europe, from Hornesteipel, where he was from, and she was from Bobov. Her father was the Bobov Rebbe. They came to America and eventually moved to Milwaukee. They had 5 sons. Their 2 older sons were born in Europe. Their oldest son was my Rebbe, who I've spoken about so many times over the years with you, Rabbi Shlomo Twerski, Hornesteipler Rebbe. That was their oldest son. And he was a Rav and a Rebbe and a Posek in Denver, Colorado, where I grew up. Their second son was Rabbi Mutzel Twerski. He was 2 years younger. They were both born in Europe, and they came here as little boys. They had 3 more sons, and the third son was Rabbi Avram Yeshua Heschel. Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twerski was the 3rd son of the Milwaukee Rebbe and his Rebbitzin. And the 4th and 5th son are twins. That's Rabbi Michael Twerski in Milwaukee and Rabbi Professor Aaron Twerski in Borough Park. Those are the 5 sons, each one of them great Talmidei Chachamim, accomplished in their own right, in their own field, each one an exceptional person, along with their Rebbitzins and their wonderful families. When we were learning back in Denver with my Rebbe, Rabbi Twerski, sometimes his brothers would come for a visit. And sometimes his brother, Reb Shia, Rabbi Dr. Twerski, would come. He'd come either to visit his older brother, our Rebbe, and he would also come sometimes to speak to Denver because he spoke everywhere, literally all over the world. A brilliant person, a brilliant speaker, and very approachable, humorous, warm person. Sometimes there would be a dinner, like a banquet, that Rabbi Twerski would have for his Mosa, his events in Denver, and he brought in his brother, Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twerski, as a speaker, and that's where we kind of got to know him. He was there for a couple days, he was there sometimes over Shabbos, and we got to know him and talk to him and developed a very beautiful friendship. We're going back now into the late 1970s, 1976 through 1981. He and the Rebbetzin and I, we looked up to him quite a bit. And he was at the same time brilliant and approachable. He knew how to take an idea and to talk about it with all kinds of people in a very cogent, relatable, often humorous way. That's how we got to know him in our years in Denver. After our Rebbe passed away, Rabbi Shlomo Twerski on Simchas Torah in Tufshin Mem Beis, 1981. Several years later, the Rebbetzin and I came here to Baltimore in 1986. In 1987, after I was here for 1 year, I was 29 years old in 1987. I was approached by a few people, Balabatim, in the community. There was a little bit of a concern that there were some problems with drugs amongst young people, just starting to rear its ugly head. And they wanted to try and deal with it. They approached me because they felt I would be a good person to try and begin some kind of program and some type to implement something to help these young people that were teenagers who were having problems with drugs. They felt I could relate to them. And remember, at that time, I was only 29 years old. I was only 12 years older than they were anyway. And I didn't have this yet. It was red. It was bright red. So they approached me and I said, okay, I'm interested. And I would find it challenging and something I'd like to try and do. I said, but I need to get an education. I had a degree. I have a degree in psychology from the University of Denver. But this is a very specific field of addiction. And I just know a little bit about it from some of my classes in college. So I decided I would call Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twerski, who at that time was living in Pittsburgh. And he had Gateway Rehabilitation Center. It was one of the primary drug and alcohol rehab centers in the United States at the time. He founded it, he managed it, he ran it. It was mainly non-Jewish people. But in that population were some Jewish people as well. And there were also some frum people. And try and picture yourself back in those days, the idea of addiction and alcoholism was barely spoken about in the Jewish community. Now there's almost not a week in a magazine where you're not going to read an article about it. But then to talk about it, it was taboo. People were afraid of it. And it was just a brand new thing. A lot of denial. Well, he was not in denial at all. This was his field. He was an expert. And he began to make inroads, not only in America, in the United States, as an authority on the topic, because he was a psychiatrist. That was his field in medicine, was psychiatry, and he branched into drug and alcohol rehab and addictions. So I knew this is the person I needed to see. I knew him. I knew he was an expert. And I said, is it possible for me, Rabbi Twerski, to talk to you a little bit and to learn about this field? So I don't remember exactly, but it was like, come on over here to Pittsburgh and we'll talk and you'll see what I do. That's what he was like. Just very approachable. Come on, come to Pittsburgh. We'll spend a few days together. It'd be my pleasure. So I hopped on a plane, went to Pittsburgh for 3 days. I stayed at his house with him and his first wife, Rabbi Goldberger, Allah Shalom. And I spent the next 3 days following him around, treating people, talking to people, listening to his lectures on 12-step program on addiction. And he literally took me everywhere he went, talking to patients, talking to people who were there for one reason or another, people who were in recovery. I had my first exposure to 12-step meetings and this whole world that existed that I only knew about from books, but I never knew about it in person. So what did I learn? I learned that alcoholism is a disease, not just a habit or a bad habit. It's a disease that needs to be treated. And I remember learning that from him. He said it so many times in so many different contexts over the course of those 3 days, that addiction is a disease. And it's a disease that needs to be treated, and it's treatable. It's not curable, but it's treatable. You can manage it, and you can live with it as long as you abide by the program, which is to go to meetings, to have a mentor, to go to counseling, and to be very real and serious about it. Those 3 days opened my eyes to the world of addictions and rehabilitation. And for the rest of my rabbinic career, Ad Hayom Hazeh, they were the most fundamental, it was the most fundamental enlightening experience that I had in that area of life. And when I did branch out over the years, in my years in the rabbinate, into areas of abuse and spousal abuse and child abuse, then it was all based on what I learned there with him and increasing that knowledge and trying to expand and help and support wherever I could. And I myself had to take a few risks in the rabbinic world when I first started to venture out in that, because not everybody was so open to these maladies. But he was a bright light for me in a very outspoken way that we can't be in denial as to what's happening in our own community, the Jewish community and the Torah community. And he wrote books about this. Rabbi Twerski has written over 90 books. So in addition to the books that you see, in the bookstores, in the Jewish bookstores, which are many, many books, there are also books he wrote in the area of addiction and rehab in 12 steps. Not Jewish books, general books for the general public. He has those books as well. He passed away a few weeks ago. I felt a void, a real void. I can't say that he was somebody who I was in touch with a lot. We saw each other every couple of years. He would sometimes come here for his simcha in his mishpacha, in the Lowenbrown mishpacha. He davened in our shul several times in celebration of some of their simchas. And here's another facet of Rabbi Dr. Twerski. When he davened for the Amid, it was so moving. There was so much heart, so much depth in his prayers, in his tefillos, in his singing. And a whole other dimension of his personality kind of opened up, the Baal Tefillah, the Baal Tefillah dimension. I hadn't seen that before. I saw it here when he came to visit Baltimore, davened for us in our shul. And I want to take that one step further. So he was prominent psychiatrist, prominent Talmud Chacham, and known as a speaker across the country. I forgot which convention it was. It was either a Nefesh convention or an Ejap convention. It was one or the other. And I was in attendance with my wife, along with many, many people. And after the Friday night program, they said there was going to be an Oneg Shabbos, which is led by Rabbi Dr. Twerski. I would call it a Tish, because that really is what it became. So here, this Hasidic psychiatrist, before my very eyes, he became a Rebbe. He was a Rebbe at that table. He wasn't talking psychiatry, he wasn't talking 12 steps and rehab. He was a Rebbe in his Divrei Torah, in his singing, in his including people. He was a very inclusive person. Everybody was a part of it. And yet, in a certain way, he was in a world of his own. And I remember watching him and thinking, this is a Rebbe. What happened to Dr. Twerski? Mamish a Rebbe. The way he conducted that Tish. Well, you know, of course, that he came by it very honestly, because he came from generations and generations of Rebbes, back to every great Rebbe who ever was almost. But to me, that was also a new side of him leading a Tish. And his personality, once again, opened up another level. I want to go back now to Pittsburgh. I was in a room and he was giving a talk to the people who were there in Gateway. There were a couple hundred people in the room, mostly not Jewish. And walks up at the front of the room to give a talk on 12 steps. A man with a beard and a long coat and payas. And it was as perfectly normal. There was nothing about it. He was so natural in his role. The only one in that whole room that was a little bit surprised was me. It was as natural as you could possibly imagine it. And he gave a talk, a beautiful, insightful talk on addiction and whatever step they were on that day, I don't remember. And talking about it, expanding on it. Chassidish, Talmud Chacham, psychiatrist, in front of, leading a room of a couple hundred, mostly non-Jewish people who were there for rehab. There was also a half dozen from Jews in that room, because at that time, that's where they went. When they got the gumption or they bottomed out and they knew they had to go, that's where they went, to Rabbi Dr. Twerski. I met them too. These were men who had addictions, either drug or alcohol. And they were there doing the serious work, either in the beginning or in the middle. I remember some of them. There was one fellow who was there, frum guy. He was 6'4", a big stocky guy. And he started to talk to me about his background and how he ended up addicted to drugs, alcohol. And he said to me, I ended up in state prison in New York. And then he said to me, you would think that that would be my bottom. You would think that being in state prison in New York would be when I bottomed out, right? I said, yeah. He said it wasn't. Got much worse than that before I hit my bottom. That was a new concept to me. You have to hit your bottom and then you turn around. If you're zoche to turn around. He was one of the people I met. I never saw him since then, but I remember him. Rabbi Dr. Twerski had that ability to, I'm going to say, talk to any person. Any Jewish person in the Jewish spectrum, any person in the human spectrum. And when he passed away, about 2 weeks ago now, I was thinking in my mind, this is a person who touched every stream of Jewish life. Everyone. Hasidish, yeshivish, modern, conservative, reform, unaffiliated, secular. He touched every single stream of Jewish life. Ashkenaz, Sfard, literally. And he touched the non-Jewish world as well in a very profound way. I don't think that I have seen that in that way. And it occurred to me that there are some people who are very broad and they do touch several different streams. We do have people like that. But he touched every stream in a very profound way, either as a psychiatrist, doctor, or as a Talmud Chacham, or as a speaker, or as a scholar in residence, or as a friend. As a friend. I just got to tell you this because it's so much him. He came to talk here to the Rabbanim in town. This must be 15, 20 years ago. And he spoke to the Rabbanim here in Baltimore on addictions, on domestic abuse, these topics. And when he came to town, it was myself and Rabbi Weinreb who were meeting him. And there was somebody in the mental health field and said to Rabbi Twerski, is there something that we can do for you during the day before you speak tonight? He says, no, I'm just going to bum around with Goldberger and Weinreb. So that was, how he talked. And then he gets up there and gives a fantastic talk that just wowed everybody in the room. Very down to earth, very, very down to earth person. One time in Denver, when he came to visit my Rabbi, he was sitting in the Beis Midrash learning. And he said, Menachem, have you ever heard of the Rambam's Nakuda Nifla'a? I said, no. He opens up a Rambam and goes with me a very complicated, complex topic in the Rambam called the Nakuda Nifla'a, the wondrous point. And he had it in his mind crystal clear. This very advanced topic. I'm trying my best just to hang on to listen and understand the words as he's describing the Rabbah. Sat down with me for a good half an hour, maybe more, going through the Rabbah. Just called me over. Inclusive. I'm kind of going back and forth between earlier years and later years. I want to make sure that I touch on my points on the paper as well. Yeah, 2 more points I wanted to touch on. We say that our avos and our imahos, that they had midos. Avram was the midah of chesed, Yitzchak the midah of gevura, Yaakov tiferes, rachamim. So what does that mean? Because after all, Avram didn't only do chesed, he was a tzaddik. So that means he did chesed and gevura, and he did racham, he did everything because he's a complete and whole person. And so did Yitzchak, and so did Yaakov. But there's an idea that there's a central trait in this person. And if you could peel back everything that they were doing, you'd see it all came back to that central trait. So Avram Avinu did an act of tremendous gevura. He brought his son, Yitzchak, as an akedah. But if you would somehow peel that back, you'd find in there chesed. That was his central midah. At Rabbi Dr. Twerski's Levaya, which was in Eretz Yisroel, he went from Pittsburgh to Muncie to Eretz Yisroel, and sometimes back and forth, and ultimately was living in Eretz Yisroel. He was buried in Beit Shemesh, the Eretz HaChaim cemetery there. And it was nighttime. It was live streamed because people were watching it. I was amongst those who were watching it. And his grandson, Chaim, came up to the Amid, to the lectern, and he said, my grandfather's instructions are that there are no hespedim, no eulogies. Those were his explicit instructions, no hespedim. And he said, we will follow my Zeta's instructions. There was not one word of eulogy that night. This is a man who could be eulogized for hours and hours, easily. That was his instruction. And then he said, my Zeta had one other instruction, that as we march to his kever, we are to sing his niggin, Hoshia Samecha. They all got together, and as they're marching for 5-10 minutes toward his kever in the Beit Shemesh, Hoshia Samecha, Vareches Nachlasecha. The Olam is singing his niggin as they're marching him to his kever, to his grave. Those were his instructions, that he wanted to be accompanied by that niggin, by that tune. That was the Levaya. No hespedim, and a march to his kever, to his niggin. The simplicity of that Levaya blew me away. It was awesome in its pashtus. It was awesome in its simplicity. And I've been thinking about it really since then. And I feel his instructions that there were no hespedim, whatever his kavanah was, I don't know. There are some great people who leave those instructions. But what it did for me is it allowed his life to speak for itself. His very life speaks for itself. Not described, lived. That was the lesson that it left me with. And as they were singing Hoshia Samecha, a certain feeling came over me. And the feeling was ahava. The feeling was love. And I was thinking in my mind, maybe that was his central midah. Maybe his central midah was ahava. What would we have said? Brilliance, compassion, consideration, working his talents, his many talents to working them to their highest level. What words would we say? All of these words, but that's not what washed over me at that moment. What washed over me was ahava. And I felt, and I still feel that perhaps that was at the core of everything that he did, was ahava. Ahavas Yisroel and ahavas habrios. Love for the Jewish people, love for all people. And perhaps that's why he was able to reach so many people with his great talents and skills, because what drove it all was love. And everybody felt that. Everybody felt that from him. That's the feeling that washed over me when I was watching the people at his Levaya march him to his kever. I felt a very strong feeling of ahava. Zechusa Yogein Aleinu, may his merit protect us and all of Klal Yisrael. A unique person, truly unique person. Many of us had the opportunity to either know him or hear him over the years. His books on many, many topics are available for us to read. He left a great legacy and a very beautiful mishpacha, a very beautiful family. So as we close our words for tonight, I would like to conclude with his beautiful nigun, Hoshia Samecha, which literally spread across the world. Hoshia Samecha, Vareches Nachlasecha, Ureim, 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 Menachem, Ureim, Menachem, Adoilam, Hoshia Samecha, Uvareches Nachlasecha, Ureim, 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 Menachem, Ureim, Menachem, Adoilam, Hoshia Samecha, Uvareches Nachlasecha, Ureim, 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 Menachem, Ureim, Menachem, Adoilam, Hoshia Samecha, Uvareches Nachlasecha, Ureim, 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 Menachem, Ureim, Menachem, Adoilam, Hoshia Samecha, Uvareches Nachlasecha, Ureim, 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 Menachem, Ureim, Menachem, Adoilam, Hoshia Samecha, Uvareches Nachlasecha, Ureim, 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 Menachem, Ureim, Menachem, Adoilam, Hoshio esamecha, uvarech es nachlasecha. Urei, murei, 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 menase maroilam. Hoshio esamecha, uvarech es nachlasecha. Urei, murei, 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 menase maroilam. Zechusa Yogin Aleinu, Zichrono Livracha, may his neshama have an aliyah, mechayel achoyel tehenish masod tzarura, b'tzrur hachayim. Everybody could unmute. We could say Erev Tov, again Chodesh, again Shabbos to everybody, to one and all.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Beautiful. Thank you. Good job.
Good Chodesh, Shabbos. Good Chodesh, Shabbos. Yashikoach.
Thank you. Good Chodesh.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Again Chodesh to everybody.
Rabbi,
Amen.
Yes,
can you try to get the recording to Yaakov tonight,
I sure
so I can try
Good
to send it?
Shabbos. Goodbye.
can. You
Okay.
too.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know what my schedule will be tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you.
I can send it over.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Good night, everybody. Again Chodesh to one and all.
Shabbos.
Good night. Good Chodesh. Erev Shabbos.
To your mother, continue to
Thank you.
Amen.
Amen. Before Shemaima. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Don, for putting up the cover there.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Which book
You're
is
fearless.
that? Not just stories. Great.
Uh-huh.
Beautiful.
15% off too.